Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel Kalanati. Today I'm going to talk about Exhalation, Stories by Ted Chiang. This is Ted Chiang's second story collection that just came out in May of 2019. It's been a 16-year gap, or maybe more like a 17-year gap actually, between this collection and his first, which is called Stories of Your Life and Others. Many of you may know that I love Ted Chiang's short fiction, and I particularly love his first collection. And I have to acknowledge two things up front. One is that I am not really prepared to film this video. You're going to be getting some rough first impressions of the stories in this from me, so apologies if it's not super well thought out. But second, I read his first collection in a particular set of emotionally charged circumstances, and for that reason and also just some other things, I am really emotionally attached to the stories in that collection in a way that I cannot duplicate with the stories in Exhalation. So this was always going to be different. It was never going to be able to live up to how I experienced his previous stories because, you know, that is a story for another time, however. So my first impression for this is that I had already read most of this collection before. So reading it this time was mainly rereading stories that I read 3, 4, 5 years ago, and I enjoyed most of it. There are some really excellent, strong pieces in this, but I do not think it packs the same punch as this first one does. Even trying to be a bit more objective about it, I don't think it is the same thing as his first collection was. There are 9 stories in Exhalation. 6 of them have been published elsewhere first, and 3 of them are published for the first time in this collection, and they range from short stories to mostly ones that are novelette or novella length. In fact, I think most everything that Chiang has published has been more in the novelette category. I forget the exact word length for that, at least in the Hugo Awards category, but he keeps getting nominated for Hugo Awards in the novelette category. So I'm going to go through these in the order in which they are presented in the table of contents, and the first one is called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. This is a story that I've now read 3 times, and it has improved for me every time that I've read it. I feel like I've gotten it and understood just the pleasure of the structure of it, the series of nested tales. I've understood that more and appreciated it more, but also the point of the story has sunk in more and more over time. It's about a merchant who encounters an alchemist who has like a wormhole portal, his gate, which you can step through and go, depending on which one you step through, you can go into the future or into the past, and you can encounter versions of yourself, your younger or your older self, and the lessons that you can learn from that. The merchant is telling his tale, why he went through the gate, to the caliph, however you say that word. He's also telling the stories of other people that he met who also used the gate, and it is really good and so splendidly written and structured. The second one is Exhalation, the title story. This is my second time reading it, though I mostly skim read it this time because it's like the one story in this that I'd already read that I didn't feel like I particularly needed to reread. It is about, I would call them sentient automatons because that's basically how they're presented, who are experiencing entropy, the running down of everything, the equilibrium at which everything will eventually settle. They require pressure differences, I think, in their atmosphere to keep going, to have their lungs work, and one of them discovers how they work and what's happening, and that they're all eventually going to run down. It's going to be the end of their world, basically. That is a terrible explanation of that story. But yeah, I only skim read it this time because, while I liked the ending of it the first time I read it, I remember feeling pretty emotionally satisfied by it. I didn't find it nearly as interesting the second time round for whatever reason. The third story is one of the newly published ones, and it is very short. It's only about 3 pages long, and it's called What's Expected of Us. It is kind of a vignette about a device called a predictor. It's exceedingly simple, but has profound implications for how people think about their futures, their lives, and their actions. The device has a light and a button, and it always flashes green before you press the button. It always predicts when you're going to press the button. And through playing with these devices, the predictors, people can become depressed and upset with their lives, that they cannot actually control whether they're going to do something or not. Their actions are like preordained and immutable. And how do people react to that through such a simple device? It Was All Right is a very short story, and most of my experiences with the very short pieces that Chiang has written is that they are interesting ideas, but I think they would be even more interesting if they were expanded into like a novelette. The next one in this collection is the Lifecycle of Software Objects. This is another reread for me, and I think it's the longest piece in the book. It is about people in like the virtual reality industry who are trying to design artificial intelligences, digital, virtual animals that will actually learn and grow over time. They can be taught. And so these people are raising digients, like digital sentiences, and like raising them like children. And the evolution of the IT industry, of the virtual reality industry as time goes on, how people react when the platform for their digients collapses or the company goes bankrupt, and this the dedication that some people have to raising their digital children in a way. What is the point of that? What are the decisions that you make as a parent, as a guardian in some ways? And it is, you know, the life cycle of software objects, the life cycle of things in the IT industry and platforms and code and all of that. And I really liked this. I remember vaguely liking it when I first read it and thinking it was a cool idea, but reading it now, again, years later, when there's been even more evolution with especially virtual reality and online shared worlds and stuff, it hit home even more because we have seen this life cycle in the online world even more clearly now, the beginning and the end and the merging of various platforms and stuff. So this one really, really worth rereading in my opinion. And I think while reading this, I pinpointed that a lot of Chiang's stories are about parenting, about the relationship that basically parents or guardians have with their children or their stand-in children. I think that's a really interesting thing that Chiang comes back to and writes about repeatedly. In that vein of parenting, but in this case parenting gone wrong, the next story is Dacey's Patent Automatic Nanny. This is about a mathematician in the 1860s who attempts to create a robotic nanny for his child. He believes that, what does it say here? It's not a replacement for human instruction, but a labor-saving device to be used by school teachers and governesses. I think the idea is that the automatons can raise children in a more consistent way without any of the human variations and affection and emotions and stuff getting in the way. And, you know, rationality, raising children in a rational way, in a very logical, rational way, will make for rational, well-educated children. It goes just about as well as you might expect it to. Not one of my favorite stories in this, but it was interesting, especially viewed in light of how many of Chiang's stories have to do with parenting and children. And after that is probably my favorite story in this collection, and possibly the very first story I ever read by Ted Chiang, and that is The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling. This story was nominated for a Hugo Award in 2014, and that was the first year that I started participating in nominating and voting for the Hugo Awards, so I read this that year, and I am pretty sure that after reading it, that's when I went out and got Chiang's first collection, Stories of Your Life and Others. And this story has pretty much all the things that I really love. It is about language and writing, and very specifically, it's about the effect that technology has on human memory, on the way that you remember and the way that you access your memories. It is basically written by a journalist who in the near future is researching how this new remembering device, it's like a search engine for life logging. When you are talking to people, when you want to recall something, it's really good at retrieving that piece of video from your life log to show you what actually happened in a moment. So instead of accessing your own organic memory of what happened, this search engine thing will pull it up for you and you can view it not in your mind, but the actual evidence of the thing. The journalist is very concerned that this is going to radically change the way that the next generation, the young people, will remember things, and he doesn't think that it's necessarily a good idea to be presented with the cold hard fact of what actually happened, with none of that eventual softening of your memories over time. He does actually try out the technology for himself. The interspersed with that, like every other section, is actually set with an indigenous tribe. I think it's in a place called Vitland. I think that's made up. It may be based on something real, but these people in their tribe and their village are introduced to writing for the first time. A young man from the village is talking to the missionary, the European missionary who arrives, who begins to teach him how to read and write, and the young man is seeing the differences between writing and written stories and how you think, how you put together your thoughts and what you want to say differently when you are composing something written versus how you experience and tell stories in the oral tradition, and the conflict that brings into how the village functions and how their system of justice works, how their politics works, that it's sometimes better for things to shift, for you to remember things differently that will serve you better in the current day. And these two different parts of the story come to different conclusions actually about the role of technology in communication and in memory. Slightly contradictory, but about the same thing, and you can see why they come to different conclusions. And I love everything about this story. I remember when I was first reading it, I was about halfway through it and just had this moment where it clicked with you, and I was like, this is magical. This works. This is the way that short fiction should be written, the way it should be told. Such a fascinating idea. The next one is another of the very short pieces. It's called The Great Silence. This is kind of like a series of vignettes and factual things that Chiang put together for an art exhibit where he collaborated with some other people. So it's not really a story with a plot. It is about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, about the Fermi paradox, and about parrots who can basically learn human speech. And it's interesting. It actually makes me sad every time that I read it, because it is about the extinction of parrots and also mentions the death of the really famous gray parrot, African gray parrot named Alex and all that. So once again, it's about language and communication, paired up, of course, with things like the Fermi paradox and aliens and the search for life, and maybe it was already here with us already. And yeah, so I like the idea, but once again, I feel like if this had been expanded into a full-blown, lengthier Ted Chiang story, I would have loved it much more. The penultimate story in this collection is called Omphalos, and it actually reminded me a bit of another Chiang story called The Tower of Babylon, which has been described as biblical science fiction. I really love that story. This is a bit different. It's basically based on the idea of how would the world be different? What could we see that would actually be different if creationists were right and the world and the universe were only about 6,000 years old? And you could see evidence of God's creation of the universe out of nothing in the fossil record. A little bit from Chiang's notes on this story. He says, "It seemed to me that if humanity really were the reason the universe was made, then relativity shouldn't be true. Physics should behave differently in different situations, and that should be detectable." So without giving away too much of the story, this follows a woman who is an archaeologist who stumbles upon evidence in another scientific paper that what we believe about God's plan for the universe may not be correct, that humanity may not be the center of the universe, it may not have been designed for us specifically, and the evidence for that comes from the rather neglected field of astronomy in this world. And I actually was really taken with this idea, particularly the way in which that Chiang imagines you would be able to see evidence of this, and how people would feel about how they would live their lives, let's say, if they have such strong evidence for what they believe is God's plan, that everything has been part of his plan all along. And what happens if that is taken away from you? What happens if that belief of yours that people and the earth are the center of the universe, that is suddenly demonstrably not true? A really good idea. I think that Chiang pulled that one off very well. And the last story in this collection is called "Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom." I'm not sure that I completely understand the title of this. I might have to spend some more time parsing exactly what that title means, but it's another one of my favorite stories from this collection. It is set in the near future when these like quantum devices called prisms have been created. When you fire up a prism, it basically splits off another universe where, with that one change in decision making, the universe starts to diverge historically. People can use the prisms to talk to their own selves in the other universe. They can talk to their what are called paraselves. This has such interesting implications for the way that people think about history, about their own decisions, and about themselves. One of the major things happening in the story is that one of the characters is a facilitator for like a group therapy session for people who are addicted to using their prisms, who are obsessed with talking to their paraselves and worrying about their own lives and the decisions that they've made. This woman, Dana, who facilitates this group, has her own decision that she made in the past that she regrets, that she's trying to atone for. But was it really her fault? And part of the story really relies on whether people think that they are to blame for certain things happening, if it was really their decision, their act that made something happen. And how can you tell? How can you tell? One of the other main things going throughout the story is a couple of characters are involved in conning people through prisms. One of them is a woman who is pretending to be a member of this therapy group. She's targeting one of the people attending it, hoping to get him to sell his prism. And why she's trying to get his prism is another major thing in the story, and really important for the end. I just loved everything about this, actually. When I first started reading it, it didn't feel really special, but then I started to really get into the characters' story arcs and why they were doing certain things. And once again, like, are they to blame for certain things happening? Does one of them actually have control of her life or not? How does she view her decisions? How does it make her the person that she is? The way that this story ended was not what I expected, and I felt like it was actually a very hopeful moment where somebody really takes a step in the right direction in their life. I'm trying to be kind of vague because I don't want to spoil it, but it was so good. I loved it. And those are my rough initial thoughts on the stories in Exhalation by Ted Chiang. I do have to admit that I am so heavily biased in favor of his first collection that this would never have completely lived up to it, but I do think it is a very worthy successor. There were many stories in this that I loved revisiting, that I got even more out of upon rereading them, and also at least 2 of the 3 stories that are new in this I thought were fantastic and more really strong ideas from Chiang. So I would absolutely recommend reading this. I do think that reading his first collection first is a good idea. But if you are one of those people who's been waiting 17 years for another story collection by Chiang, it is absolutely worth the wait.